Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Thursday, August the 10th, 2023. Today I want to talk about Vladimir Putin, and specifically I want to predict or forecast when he's going to die. And I want to make this forecast with particular reference to the Saturn-Uranus cycle, which I believe is very important for Russia and the Soviet Union before it. Now, underlying what I say is my view that people like Vladimir Putin and any senior politician, Joe Biden, Boris Johnson when he was Prime Minister, Macron, Rishi Sunak, whatever, they don't actually have a lot of free will because, the universe kind of knows which way the world is moving. There's nothing really that us humans down here, us ordinary humans can do. And if you are a senior politician, you are just an instrument of the universe. You're just there to help things along our way. And so when you go into politics, particularly the highest levels of politics, you think you're doing it to change the world. That's not actually true. You're doing it because you just want to become a tool of the universe. And so in a way, by getting into high level politics, you are losing your humanity. So this view that Vladimir Putin is not a human being. I mean, in a way that is correct, but it's not personal. Joe Biden's not a human being. You've just become an instrument of the collective destiny when you go into politics. In terms of your death, you die when the universe regards you as being surplus to requirements. So if you're an ordinary person like me, for example, it doesn't really matter whether I live or die in terms of the grand scheme of things. So perhaps I have more free will. You and I, we've got a lot more free will than senior politicians. It's great having the trappings of power, but having the trappings of power and status and control, it does have a cost. And that cost is our humanity. So as far as the war between Russia and Ukraine is concerned, people always talk about, it's Putin's war. It's not Putin's war. It's just a war that was going to happen. If Putin had not have existed, there would still be a war between Russia and Ukraine, or Russia and Ukraine and NATO, depending on how you see it. If at the end of communism, Russia had decided to bring back the Tsar, for example, the war would still be going on, I believe. At least that's my view of the world. But having said all that, I think we can look at Vladimir Putin's horoscope. So let's have a look. Now, when you look at Vladimir Putin's horoscope, you have to remember that we do not have a time of birth for him. Some people claim there's a time of birth. They've got it somehow, but we don't have a time of birth. Now, if Prince Harry, remember how Prince Harry had this grand idea that he could interview Putin and I think Pope Francis regarding childhood trauma or something like that. Now, if Prince Harry had got his interview with Vladimir Putin, then maybe he could have asked Putin what time he was born, and then the mystery would have been solved. So as it stands, we don't know what time of birth he is, so we are dealing with what is known as sort of a flat chart. So this is for October the 7th, 1952. I've set it for noon in Leningrad. Which is what Petersburg, St. Petersburg was called under communism. So the thing that I want to look at is Saturn and Uranus in his chart. So you can see that Vladimir Putin has Uranus at 18 Cancer and he's got Saturn at 17 Libra. And in fact, I don't really want to look at any other planets now except for Saturn and Uranus. These are the only planets I'm interested in this video. So in that spirit, I'm going to actually just remove these other planets, which really we don't need. So let's just remove all of them. There you go. That's all I want to look at. For the rest of the video, we're not going to be talking about any other planets except for Saturn and Uranus. So that is Vladimir Putin's chart, or October the 7th, 1952, Saturn and his Uranus. They are in square. They are 90 degrees apart. And as far as I'm concerned, the Saturn-Uranus cycle is very important for Russia. Now, from a Ptolemaic point of view, now Ptolemy was an astrologer, an astronomer. I think he was working in the 2nd century AD. He associated Russia, and in fact Ukraine as well, I think that part of the world, with the sign Aquarius. And I think this still holds true today. And Aquarius is ruled by Saturn. Now, some modern astrologers, and I do disagree with them, argue that that Aquarius is also ruled by Uranus. But I suppose I kind of accept that Saturn and Uranus maybe but both Saturn and Uranus have a connection with Aquarius. But Russia being an Aquarian country, it certainly is connected with Saturn, but I suppose if you're a modern astrologer, you might say it's got a connection with Uranus. And I think there is evidence, as far as I can see, that Saturn and Uranus are strongly related to the destiny of Russia. So I want to follow them through and look at the cycle of Saturn and Uranus. Now, as far as cycles are concerned, I just want to say one point about cycles. In astrology, cycles are important. It's the idea of repetition, that in some way, at some level, okay, history doesn't necessarily repeat, but it rhymes, and that we can follow cycles through. So what do I mean by a cycle? So the archetypal cycle, the cycle that helps us understand all other cycles, is the lunation cycle. And there was an astrologer, Dane Rudyard, who wrote a whole book called The Lunation Cycle. That's certainly worth reading if you're into psychological astrology, and perhaps to understand cycles in general. And so the idea of the lunation cycle is that it starts at the new moon. Sun and moon are conjunct. They're in the same place. It's dark. At least the sun and the moon are in the same place from the Earth's perspective. And at the new moon, it's dark. But the moon is moving faster from the sun from the Earth's perspective. So after the new moon, you start to see the moon getting larger and larger. When the moon is 90 degrees from the sun, that's the first quarter. Then when it's 180 degrees, that's the full moon, sun opposition moon. That's when the moon has waxed as far as it can go. The moon is full. And then after that, the moon wanes. It gets smaller. You get a second square as the last quarter moon. And then you go back to the original new moon. So the cycle repeats every month. So as far as the Saturn-Uranus is concerned, we get the same picture. So let's look at the Saturn-Uranus cycle from a perspective of, say, 1920. This is June the 7th, 1920. Now, the Saturn-Uranus cycle, now I'd said that the lunar cycle is about a month. The Saturn-Uranus cycle is a lot longer than a month. I think it's sort of about 46 years or something like that from Saturn-Uranus conjunction to conjunction. It's sort of late 40s years, something like that. So I'm picking this up at the opposition, when Saturn and Uranus are opposition each other, June the 7th, 1920. So what was going on in Russia in 1920? Well, there was a civil war. This was towards the end of the Civil War. I think it was becoming clear that the Bolsheviks, there were two sides to this war. You had the sort of Bolsheviks, I know that might be a simplification, the communists. They were fighting the whites, i.e. people who wanted a restoration of the old regime. Whites were obviously anti-communist. They were heavily supported by the Western powers. So similar position than you've got now, because now you could argue that what's going on Russia-Ukraine is a kind of a civil war. And of course, some people are going to really hate that view, that it's a civil war. And you've got the West heavily intervening in the Russia-Ukraine war at the moment, as they were doing in 1920. So this has happened to Russia before. So all of Britain, America, France, Japan, they were all supporting the whites, and wanting to overthrow the Bolsheviks, to prevent the Bolsheviks from taking over. So this Saturn-Uranus here, you could say that Saturn is the old regime, Saturn in Virgo, perhaps. And Uranus are the revolutionaries, the Bolsheviks, and so they are opposition each other. So you've got two forces that are opposition each other. You've got perhaps Saturn is the status quo, Uranus is the revolution, and this opposition is the last opposite. Because what happens when you've got Saturn-Uranus cycles? Every time they aspect, they go retrograde. So you're going to get a couple of aspects within about a year or two. There's going to be a lot of the same aspect will repeat. So when I look at these aspects, I've always gone for the same. I've gone for the last one of this cycle. So this was of that particular phase of the cycle. So this is a civil war. This was coming to the end of it. It didn't really end until 1922, but I think the Bolsheviks at this stage had got the upper hand. And so we can move this cycle on. So the next stage of the cycle would be the Saturn-Uranus square. So you can see that Saturn's at 17 Capricorn in 1931, moving towards that conjunction with Uranus. So 1931, the Soviet Union was established, it had won its civil war, but now with the square you start to see a few cracks forming, a few crises forming. People are resisting Stalin. Stalin was in control by this stage, but not in complete control, certainly not in sufficient control for his own satisfaction. And so we see the purges. Okay, the purges had started sort of late 20s. People started getting purged, but Saturn-Uranus is a crisis of control, and so that's how that is manifesting. And then we have the last 10 years before the conjunction, and so 11 years later, 1942, Saturn moves forward, and we have a conjunction, which is May the 3rd, 1942. So you can see Saturn and Uranus are now together. So that's like the new moon stage of the cycle. Now, 1942 was in the middle of the Second World War. And the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, in terms of the Second World War, kind of represented the turning point. this was the point in the Second World War where Germany really started to lose. You know, Pearl Harbor had been December 1941. In terms of the war against the Japanese, this was the sort of a peak of Japanese control and power. After this, it took a long time, but Japan was going to lose. It was inevitable. I think it was inevitable that Germany was going to lose at this stage. So it was a turning of the tide, but it was a conjunction in the darkness for Russia. At that time, Russia may have saved Moscow, but the Germans were still advancing, and the defeat of the Soviet Union must have still felt to be a real possibility. Stalingrad was yet to happen. The Germans were still. They were still advancing. They were wanting to go towards the Caucasus, the oil fields. That's what they were trying to go for, and it probably felt very bleak if you were in the Soviet Union, particularly in Leningrad. Leningrad was Vladimir Putin's city, and it was under siege. And in a way, this conjunction between between Saturn and Uranus represents the birth of Vladimir Putin. Now, I know he was born in 1952, 10 years later, but his older brother, Viktor, who was born in 1940, died in 1942. Viktor was caught up in the siege of Leningrad. This infant, I think he had diphtheria, starvation. He was taken away from his parents, I believe, to help him get away from the siege, but he died. And I think the fact that he died so close to the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, this new cycle, the brother of a future leader, and I think that the memory of this death, the trauma of his death on Vladimir Putin, must have been sort of immense. If Prince Harry had have got his way and he wanted to interview leaders about childhood trauma, didn't he want to interview Putin and Pope Francis? Maybe this is what he should have been talking about, because in families, what happens before you're born is really important. And so the memory of his dead brother, I'm sure, must have had a big impact on Vladimir Putin. And so you could say that Vladimir Putin really was born in 1942. This thing that he stands for, that trauma, the fact that the Soviet Union was nearly destroyed by Germany and the West. Germany is a Western power, is with him. And so this is the beginning of Vladimir Putin, I would argue, at least in a psychological sense. So 10 years later, Vladimir Putin was born. Now, in 1952, on October the 15th, there was a Saturn-Uranus square. The conjunction had already happened. Saturn was moving away. So this is like the first quarter of the cycle. Stalin was nearly dead. Stalin died in March 1953. So, Soviet Union was starting to recover. It was starting to find itself. And so Vladimir Putin was born on October the 7th. So he was born 8 days before the square, so before the exact square. And so in a way, this Saturn-Uranus cycle, which is so important to Russia, is hard coded into Vladimir Putin's horoscope. He is part of this cycle, and I think this takes away from him his individuality. He must respond to this cycle. Now, as a young man, and as a child and a young man, there's not really much he can do about it, is there? I mean, if you look sort of, okay, 1966, we had the opposition. I would argue that this is the peak of Russia's cultural influence. It was, before Russia had to, for example, the Prague Spring, 1968, was when Czechoslovakia tried to assert its independence, and the Soviet Union had to send in the tanks. But that was really a sign of weakness. So 1966 was before the Prague Spring. The Soviet Union had established itself. The Soviet Union was doing stuff like it set up the Patrice Lumumba school for educating anti-colonial leaders, people from Africa. So its cultural influence was really at a peak, and we didn't have all the stuff about dissidents and Charter 77 that happened later, and the real ossification of the Brezhnev regime. So yeah, 1966 was arguably the peak. Then 10 years later, 1977, we had the Square. Yeah, this was when the Charter 77. Charter 77 was some sort of Western-backed group to sort of really agitate for human rights and freedom of expression in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. People, at the time, people were always talking about dissidents, and so by this time, by the waning Square, the Soviet Union was kind of in decline, but no one really recognized that it was over, that it was going to soon collapse. I remember I was doing some course in East European history in the early 80s, and the lecturer, a very renowned man, was just. He was basically saying he didn't say once that the Soviet Union was under threat. He was even saying that, East Germany was beginning to develop its own separate culture. So it was as if it was a fait accompli in the early 80s. So people didn't realize this. But, reality is this was a sort of a point of decline after 1977, increasing sort of opposition to the Soviet Union and in Eastern Europe. Plus, the economy started to really collapse with the decline in commodity prices after 1980. So this was the first crisis. 1977 symbolically was the beginning of the end. And of course, 2 years later, just over 2 years later, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and that really didn't help. And then we moved to by the way, 1975, yeah, that's when Putin joined signed up with the KGB. Then we move to 1988. This is the conjunction. This is the end of the cycle, beginning of a new cycle. Communism was still around in 1988. Gorbachev was the Soviet leader, and this is the beginning of a new cycle. It was the Soviet Union. We knew that the Soviet Union was going to collapse at some stage by 1988, I think, and so now we're in the Saturn-Uranus represents the new cycle that Russia is in, or because it became Russia because the Soviet Union, with the end of the Soviet Union. So the first square of this happened in 1999, and remember, the 1990s were a time of humiliation for Russia. That first quarter from the new moon, the Saturn-Uranus conjunction, to the first quarter in 1999-2000 was humiliation. Was absolutely humiliating. Its economy collapsed on a global scene. 1999, you had the West attacked Serbia. totally the bombing of Serbia, forcing it to let go of Kosovo. West using depleted uranium, and Russia could do really nothing. It had to just stand by, and that's the humiliation, and that is the beginning of the return. Nothing lasts forever, and so the Saturn-Uranus was, I think there was a Saturn-Uranus square in, I think, July 1999, then in November 1999, and finally there was a Saturn-Uranus square in 2000. I make it May the 17th, 2000. Now, something important happened in May the 17th, 2000. Vladimir Putin was officially sworn in as Russian president. He had become acting president in December, I think in December 1999. So he became president. Vladimir Putin became president of Russia almost exactly on the Saturn-Uranus square. So this is the first quarter. So the new cycle, 1988 is the start of the real bottom. It's the absolute low point when Soviet Union is collapsing. It's just in the absolute pits. But then this is the first square. This is like something new, sort of rising, perhaps rising from the ashes, and Putin becoming president. And Putin represents the concept of enough is enough, and so this is his destiny. His destiny was to become president. Was to become president of Russia, and it's in his chart. Then you move forward to the Saturn opposition in 2009. So 2008, Russia had its war with Georgia. So Russia was already in 2008 was starting to assert itself, and I think that the Saturn-Uranus opposition again. Putin is in control now, and so this represents a new cycle where the opposition is now about how Russia recovers. Remember that opposition in 2020? There was an opposition. Sorry, in 1920, that was the end of the Civil War. When Russia was starting to get the upper hand. So again, this is a similar situation in 2009. This is about Russia has recovered, but it's still not. It's recovered, and it's kind of working out how to assert itself. And then the next square, Saturn-Uranus. So the next Saturn-Uranus square is in 2021. December the 24th, 2021, there was a Saturn-Uranus square. This was less than 2 months before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So again, this shows how plugged into the Saturn-Uranus cycle Russia is, and also it shows how plugged in Vladimir Putin is. He is completely part of this cycle. So the question is, what about the conjunction? There is a conjunction between Saturn and Uranus in less than 10 years' time. What's this going to be about? Now, as far as I'm concerned, I wrote a sort of article in 2020 on my blog. I believe that the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, which was at 0 degrees Aquarius at 0 degrees Aquarius at the end of 2020, was about not just a Russian decade, but a Russian 20 years. My view is that this is perhaps the beginning of a new and powerful Russia. As far as I'm concerned, it is quite inevitable that Russia will win its war with Ukraine, and I think this is shown by the Saturn-Uranus cycle. That this cycle, the cycle that started in 1988, is about the development of Russia. We've had the opposition, which is about this crisis for Russia, but having to realize it. Russia realizing in 2008, 2009, but it's going to have to fight for everything. But it's going to have to stand up and deal with the humiliation it experienced in the 1990s. We saw with the waning square in 2021 that presaged its war against Ukraine. So this Saturn-Uranus conjunction, I actually think this is the first chance for Putin to die. Because he's so plugged into the Saturn-Uranus cycle that I am convinced he's going to die on a Saturn-Uranus aspect. So 2032, he may die, in 2032. That's the earliest point. He's going to survive until 2032. But he was born on a waxing Saturn-Uranus square. So when is the next waxing Saturn-Uranus square? Well, actually, the next waxing Saturn-Uranus square is in 2043. And Putin will actually be 91 in 2043. Now, I know people in the West have said that Putin's got all sorts of diseases like cancer and Parkinson's disease and so forth. But I think, in terms of my prediction about when he's going to die, I think he's going to die in 2043 and he's going to be 91. If not, he may die at the age, he might die around 80 at the Saturn-Uranus conjunction in 2032. But looking at all this, I think that Putin's got he's got a lot longer to go. And what I've wanted to show in this, perhaps this rather rambling video, is that Putin, as a politician, he's not really a human being, like all politicians. He is plugged into a wider cycle, and so he doesn't really have much choice. He is, in a way, a tool of the universe. So we've just had, what happens with Saturn-Uranus shows what's happening to Putin. Him and Saturn-Uranus are one and the same thing. And we maybe don't have to look at the rest of Putin's chart. Maybe the only planets that matter in Putin's chart are Saturn and Uranus. So thank you for listening. Thank you for bearing with me. Sorry this video was rather rambling, but if you've got this far, I'm assuming you kind of vaguely understand the point I'm trying to make. Thanks for listening.